It's time we once again revisit Game Changers, a recurring and episodic series here on the channel in which we examine powers, abilities, spells, devices, techniques that characters can have in role-playing games. And once we agree to bring these game changers into our RPG gaming, this could be a session 0 choice if it's a matter of homebrew content, or it might be just a matter of which RPG we chose. Then our role-playing of the world as game masters, our role-playing of our characters as players, the world building of what is in the world and how NPCs behave and how civilizations develop and unfold, should perhaps acknowledge that these abilities are in play, that they're part of the world. That's what a game changer is. We're going to be looking at the Combat Wheelchair, which is a homebrew supplement for 5th edition D&D, which has become very widely accepted, recognized, applauded by some big-time D&D celebrities, and looks like it will become a fixture in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It has its share of controversy around it. It has a share of nitpicking, and there are some things about it that I have some questions and thoughts about. And I'm going to share them with you in this video here. But before we go into it in any greater depth, I want to give you the TLDR so that we don't misunderstand each other. Basically, it's fine. So let's begin with some disambiguation. I'm speaking specifically about the Combat Wheelchair version 2.0 by Mustang's Art, also known as the Dislocating GM on Twitter. And I'm going to be sticking specifically to the text of that PDF. And then I'll kind of reply to some different critiques of the idea of a quasi-magical mobility chair within the default assumed settings of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons as a specific D&D game, which may have different things that set its default setting apart from other editions of D&D. And also acknowledging that there are other medieval fantasy role-playing games where, you know, the answers may be different. And so I think that the answers to, is this a good fit? And how does this work with D&D as it exists, are good to answer specifically for the game that this supplement is built for. Before we get too deep down into the weeds of refuting some of the neckbeardy or nitpicky critiques of what bringing the supplement into a game might mean, before I speak to some of my own questions or even insecurities that I might have as a game master after I have enthusiastically welcomed the Combat Wheelchair to my table, which I absolutely would, I would like to speak first to the primary imperative. This is a high fantasy heroic world-building game. Our player characters are on a heroic destiny that, if it continues successfully, they will reach a state of godlike power. It's a place where we imagine that we're in the role of people who can respond to crises, world-shaking ones, with incredible abilities that allow us to meet those crises head-on. And each of us, each player who walks up to the table, often would at least like the opportunity to embark upon that heroic destiny of their character with a character that is somewhat like themselves, that shares some components of their identity. And within the context of this game, which is absolutely not preoccupied with historical accuracy, it is not interested in providing an opportunity to revisit the past of racism and chauvinism and sexism and bigotry.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business.
It's an inclusive default setting. And likewise, the culture of play around this role-playing game, and I should hope many role-playing games, or perhaps all, is an inclusive one in the sense that all different sorts of people with different sorts of abilities and disabilities, neurodiversity, different colors, sexual orientations, and genders have the opportunity to come together and play. And that within the context of this not very historical-minded game about high fantasy heroic destinies, the characters have a pretty even go at embarking on that heroic trajectory. If I'm playing 5th edition D&D and I'm playing a pansexual tiefling cleric, I don't think that that character is going to have an especially difficult go of things any harder or with more resistance from the world than the other player characters. That's just the way that the culture of play has taken shape around 5th edition, and this supplement is for that game. Thusly, in service to that goal of creating an opportunity for the different sorts of players, including disabled folks, to have characters that can enter the game that look like themselves and are also able to embark upon the heroic trajectories that are presumed in the game and in the culture of play. I believe that to serve that end, this supplement, the combat wheelchair, is an excellent means. The chair itself is largely modeled after the sort of chairs used in Paralympic wheelchair rugby. I'm going to show a little bit of footage of Paralympic wheelchair rugby, let it speak for itself, and then leave it to your imagination to add something like a sword or a spear into the mix. And I think you can picture the bugbear on the other end of it in a dungeon, and there'd be peril for that bugbear, to be sure. The magical component of the chair is something called beacon stones, which line the rims of the wheels, and there's one on the armrest. And the total effect of them is to allow the chair to traverse rough terrain with ease, the same ease as regular adventurers at a speed of 25 feet in a round over specific terrain types: coast, forest, mountain, and grassland terrains. And that includes off-road. And that is, to my mind, in sync with the cantrip level wondrous item magic that it's described as. The armrest beacon stone allows the chair to hover 2 feet off the ground when going up and down stairs. Now we come to the part of the video where we deconstruct, dunk, and otherwise critique the folks with various neckbeardy style critique responses to the combat wheelchair. First, some people look at this as exceptionally powerful. They think that this is introducing a magic item for free for first level characters, and that seems a bit much. Let me put it to you this way, okay? There's warlocks in the game, which have some spell slots that refresh with short rests. I will also mention that there's a sailor background, which gives the character the ability to transport them and their companions across thousands of miles, and they can utilize that privilege from the sailor background at first level. There's also a background which gives you the facilities of a squire or lackey that follows you around and minds your horse outside of the dungeon, for example, or might be sent back to town to carry a message. If we compare those background abilities in an objective and impartial sense with a character beginning play with the combat wheelchair free of charge, I think we can see that the power levels are pretty similar. I think maybe the sailor background might in fact be considerably more game-changing. And while we're looking at things in proportion, it should be noted that characters in 5th edition D&D level very quickly. And they reach level 3, level 5 within the space of 1 or 2 sessions very often. And at that point, they have literal piles and piles of per day spells and novel class abilities that can give them things like levitation, things like flight, and getting across chasms with spells like Misty Step becomes a pretty regular occurrence in play. Next, let's visit the critique that the pseudo-magical 200 gold piece valued combat wheelchair might warp the economies of the assumed settings of Dungeons & Dragons. Once again, I've got to point out to you that 5th edition D&D is a particular and peculiar edition. Magic and player characters are right here described on page 8 as few and far between, and the sort of thing which you don't see every day, and folk in the world don't see every day. By that I mean that there may only be a score or a dozen adventurers in the world who embark upon heroic destinies as level 1 characters who also have a disability which gives them the need and cause to bring a combat wheelchair into play. It's imaginable that the fantasy setting might only have 12 to 20 combat wheelchairs in it at any one time. So it also stands to reason that that means that it's definitely not going to warp any economies for it to be brought into play. Another angle of this critique that folks have brought up is that the hovering capability of the chair might be a form of industrial technology which is out of sync with the sort of settings that Dungeons & Dragons takes place in. Well, I've got news for you there. Both Waterdeep and the Forgotten Realms in general, Eberron, and the sorts of fantasy worlds that Dungeons & Dragons has been taking place in for the past 25, 30 years or so have been very high fantasy worlds with a lot of Magitech, flying airships, and literal submarines. Waterdeep Dragon Heist has a segment where it's assumed that the characters will use an apparatus of Qualish. There's not really a visual canon which is being broken by a minor technological artifact like this being brought into the imagined visuals of the game. Likewise, the population densities of these worlds, the sorts of bureaucratic and governmental organization, the level of sanitation which is present in cities, including these underground sewers that are ubiquitous, it all adds up to the sort of setting which sounds a whole lot more like the year 1800 or even 1900 than it does like the year 1200 when you really start to look at things. And those settings are the settings that this game is assumed to take place in, and that most people in their mind's eye tend to be imagining it to take place in. The next critique of the combat wheelchair in Dungeons & Dragons rests on the faulty premise that clerical magic would cure away the existence of physical disability altogether in the high fantasy setting. Here's a 30-second thought exercise which refutes that pretty quickly. I can think of tons of other causes of disability which aren't tied to injury, which are either congenital in origin, which might relate to magical accidents, other planar forces, even astrological influences like the planets. Now, I don't want to fetishize disability and get all dreamy and brainstorm exactly what these different causes might be. I just bring this up to say it's so easy to imagine other causes of disability in fantasy that clerical magic would be powerless against. Second refutation of this claim is the idea that religions would actually care to use their powers to help people. Because we know from IRL that they don't always have that as a priority, or they even like to withhold certain services, which they view as sacraments, and they try to be choosy about who's worthy of those. And that's, clerics are the ones who cast these spells. And finally, we can imagine there might be other priorities, which might, put a pull on a 7th level spell slot that a 13th level cleric in the world might have. There might be other planar forces. There might be national security concerns which eat up, whatever 7th level spell slots they have lying around. Or they might just save them all day and not cast them for their own personal safety if a crisis comes up. So I don't think it's inconceivable that physical disability would persist. So even if we get down into these sorts of very simulationist greenery, or we might even call it weeds, which, the prior editions of 3.x Dungeons & Dragons could tell you how many 13th level clerics there are in a city. Even if we go to that level, I'm not sure that the premise can stand. I think it's hogwash.
I think the call on this one is pretty clear.
It's busted.
It's totally busted.
So I think that puts to rest these critiques as nitpicky and really maybe not literate to what this game is relative to other D&Ds. With that said, let's imagine that I've now welcomed the combat wheelchair to my game table as a game master. And I want to talk to you about a couple of questions and a couple of interesting complications which I imagined could arise that I discovered my play style might even bring about, which is awkward. When I sit down as a dungeon master and prepare an adventure, or I adopt an adventure module like this one, I imagine that I am building a world that once I've kind of created the setting of play, be it a dungeon or the like, where the stairs are, which doors lead where, which monsters are inside which rooms, I don't change that on the fly. If there's a secret door, I have it written down where the secret door leads, rather than, you found a secret door, you tell me where it leads. To me, that is more of a dungeon world style of game, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, there is an objective reality that I am role-playing and creating. Now, this isn't to say that when I'm building the adventure, when I'm selecting the module, I don't keep an eye open for if the player character group is really compatible with the adventure. So, for example, I'm not going to hide something with magical runes on a wall that can only be seen by someone that is casting detect magic if the characters are entirely martial. Or more precisely, I'm not going to send player characters on a fool's errand towards a quest that they cannot accomplish. I'm not going to dangle an adventure hook that turns out to be a red herring. And knowing my own preferences in play, I realized as I started to consider the combat wheelchair in play that there could be a number of occasions that could arise where I might be perceived as presenting a wheelchair inaccessible environment in the dungeon. And I started to wonder what sort of censure with an S, as in finger pointing, put you in the stocks and shaming type of behavior game masters might face when these circumstances arise in play. And when I asked questions about this in the internet, boy, I ended up in the stocks myself, in the sense that I really people dunked on me for several days. The thing that I discovered is that my own play preferences for a fixed objective reality, the idea that the dungeon is the dungeon, the world is the way it is, are somewhat exceptional in the culture of play nowadays. I was talking to people who assume that the dungeon master is sort of making things up on the spot or will change things in the moment and kind of fiddle with the fiction behind the screen in a manner to facilitate play and to keep things moving and to help the characters, the players, be entertained and have a fun adventure.
Razzle dazzle, and they'll never catch wise.
To me, the fun comes from discovering the story, from seeing where the die rolls and the challenges lead, the drama of seeing success and failure hang in the balance. That is not necessarily the case for everyone. And I hadn't realized in my mind that if I was to create an adventure which involved ladders and there was a centaur player character at the table, I might be perceived as dunking on that character. I'm trying to exploit a weakness or create a gotcha moment if something like that appears in the fiction of the world. On the other side of the coin, when I'm preparing environments, when I'm creating adventures, when I'm imagining and role-playing the system of cause and effect that is the world, I try to hold myself to a code of ethics where the world doesn't always see which player characters are coming. If the player character party is full of elves and they're headed toward the goblin camp, I don't run and scribble in my notes that the goblin chief's sword is now a +2 elf-bane sword. That would be compromising the fiction. That would be bending reality in the same way. And some of the good faith answers that I got to my concerns during this period where I was the laughingstock of the internet revolved around positive changes to the fiction to make sure that wheelchair inaccessible moments didn't happen. So, for example, if you can imagine, there's a doorway on page 94, and in the gray box text, it says that the doorway is 18 inches wide, and the corridor beyond is a tight squeeze. That would be narrower than the combat wheelchair itself, which might, if it was left unaltered in the moment, lead to the character in the combat wheelchair needing to disembark or disassemble the wheelchair in order to get through the narrow squeeze, or possibly for the group to find an alternate route around. And the good faith answer that I got was to just change it, to just make it just wide enough. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I'm receptive to that idea. It's simply a matter of I may not think to do it until it is done. I may not realize I'm not perfect, and sometimes as a human being, I get caught up in different parts of managing the social situation, imagining the world, and the extra little bit of empathy and kind of anticipation that involves recognizing the different characters that are there and then maybe tweaking things a little bit to match with the characters that are there. Not only is it not my usual style, but I wonder whether I might make mistakes and miss those beats. So now the details in the world, do we retcon it? And, on top of that, there may be situations where you introduce a detail and nobody realizes that it's really problematic or troublesome, or might be perceived as inaccessible. But then down the line, events that nobody could anticipate could unfold based on that detail. So an example might be that you end up going down the narrow passageway, and maybe I did change it so that it's just the width of the chair, and the party is proceeding down, and on the far end of the passageway, I didn't change what monster it was, and it's a young adult red dragon who's feasting on a recent kill of a prize bull, which he's clutched out of the fields of a nearby farmer. And the party sees this, and they now need to back up down the same narrow squeeze passageway. So now we're in a situation where the character who's in the combat wheelchair may not be able to pivot, given that the passageway is a specific width. Now that we've set that, we made the minimal adjustment, what does that bode for the future? And it's at this point that people started to accuse me of reaching at grasping at straws. The idea of narrow doorways and crawl spaces may be unfamiliar to a modern audience. I take them as novel, but not uncommon MacGuffins in dungeon environments. And a lot of these older adventures, this one is based on Against the Slave Lords, have very specific sorts of descriptions of what an environment looks like. And the narrow doors thing isn't the only one. I can imagine things like an illusion of a stone floor, which turns out to be water or quicksand or a gelatinous cube. And I just want to take a minute to remind everybody I'm not coming up with these things to be cruel. I wouldn't devise these things in a sinister fashion to dunk on the character in the combat wheelchair. They're just things that might become more complicated for that character in ways that I didn't necessarily anticipate ahead of time. As for why I think these questions and considerations are worthy of consideration, I think it comes down to Game Master's joie de vivre, their elan going into the game. How excited are you to be a GM? How much creativity do you inject into it? And how much are you concerned about how your creativity might cause an incident? We already saw how the Matt Mercer effect burdened a lot of young GMs before it started to kind of get a lot of pushback. Kids were trying to be like Matt Mercer and trying to have that over-the-top, outgoing, funny voices for NPCs kind of GMing. And it was proving to be a source of real anxiety. And it was almost keeping people away from the GM's chair. And in our efforts to be inclusive, I want to make sure that the GM's chair remains inclusive to neurodiverse folks and people who have anxieties, just in general. That's why it's a concern. So here's my answer. After several days in the Twitter penalty stocks, and after kind of trying to keep a good attitude and having some heart-to-heart talks with my wife, who works with spinal cord injury patients herself on a daily basis. Here's the deal. My play preferences are out of the ordinary. I'm the unusual one nowadays. I'm comfortable with that. That's fine. I'm the objective reality guy. I'm the DM who plays the game that way. And in session 0, in that time where you're meeting people and getting ready to play the game, you can go ahead and explain that preference. The absolute least I can do is explain how my way of playing might lead to these situations. We can talk in this session 0 about how I might adjust my way of playing, how comfortable folks are with this objective reality sort of play ahead of time before we get too deep into it. And at a convention game or adventure league sort of environment, it's a matter of just quickly asking the player who's bringing the combat wheelchair, perhaps using a written sort of thing that they could write down, or just away from the rest of the group so they don't feel shamed or anything. How should I adjust my playstyle? Or should I adjust my playstyle at all? What would you prefer? And I think that that's the accommodating and inclusive way to go about this, because there are a lot of different ways of playing the game. This particular Dungeons and Dragons game is being played by a lot of folks who, in their culture of play, don't do the objective reality thing. And that's okay. I'm the weird one. And will I end up banned from Adventure League one day? Will I be not welcome to run games at Gen Con because of a mistake, a misunderstanding, something unforeseen arising in play that ends up being reported to the convention bureau rather than talked over after the session? That could happen. But you know what? A lot of that is my responsibility. Just speak to the way that I play and understand how it might cause problems and be willing to adjust it. And where I think that my play style has merit, where I think that it's worth saving this old objective reality way of playing, I should be comfortable being out of the closet about it. So nobody's forcing you to adopt the combat wheelchair at your home game. Although I think that it's going to be a pretty standard way of being inclusive to characters with disability within the next few years, it or something like it. No one's forcing you to play 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons over other kinds of D&D, which may have a different aesthetic. Nobody's forcing you to play Dungeons and Dragons, a high fantasy game where magical technology stuff exists. Medieval realism style gaming is a thing. There are some videos about the medieval world of Harn on my channel, and perhaps I'll speak to how disabled characters might fit into a campaign in Harn someday. But for this game, for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, for this culture of play, for the very inclusive assumed setting, for the pretty assumed magical technology high fantasy environment that is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in a default sense, the combat wheelchair is fine. These questions that arise once we start playing with it and welcoming it are something to sort out. And I know that sometimes these discussions will get difficult. I know that sometimes people might get angry at me for asking questions in the safe and relatively anonymous space of the internet. And I'm okay with that sometimes leading to an escalated conversation. I learned from that conversation. I became a bigger person from it. And when you see changes in the RPG world, I would encourage you to take a page out of my book here and roll with the changes.